Hi, my name's Emma. I'm the head of geography at St Michael's Catholic College, and today I'm going to talk about geography across the different key stages and how we can try to ensure that there is continual progression across them all, especially in that primary to secondary transition. So in this session we have two main aims to cover. Firstly, what does the geography curriculum look like across different key stages? And secondly, how can primary and secondary practitioners ensure that teaching and learning builds on and develops what is learnt in the previous key stage? So this is one of the main questions that this presentation aims to encourage you to think about. When preparing this session, I came up with 5 main ideas of how we can try and ensure that teaching and learning in geography continues to develop what is learnt in previous key stages. You can see that we have observation of practice, school visits, examples of work and testing, and comparison of the national curriculum requirements. This session will focus mostly on the national curriculum requirements at Key Stage 2 and 3, and also examples of work at different key stages with a focus on Key Stage 3. So, as I said, really looking at how we can ensure progress from that primary to secondary transition. The other 3 areas that I've listed would all be valuable when thinking about possible school-to-school support and creating links between primary and secondary schools to ensure and encourage development of the subject and potentially additional support from subject specialists. I think it's important to say here that I'm speaking from a secondary geography teacher's perspective. That obviously is going to influence my thoughts about what progression looks like, and to a certain extent it explains why examples of work are mainly from Key Stage 3. This is what the national curriculum says about high quality geography education. This is written for all key stages, linking them all together in what geography education should look like. Personally, as a geography enthusiast, I think it's quite easy to do in geography. As a subject, it does inspire curiosity and fascination about the world. It does give an understanding of the Earth and its key processes, and it's almost impossible to teach without demonstrating how humans and nature interact. What I'd like you to think about is, what do you already do in your curriculum or in individual lessons to achieve each of these things? How do you inspire that curiosity? How do you foster that knowledge of processes and demonstrate that interaction? If you pause the video here, write down what you think you or your department already do to achieve these aspects of a high quality geography education, and then restart the video when you've had an opportunity to think. So you may have written down the content that you teach them. You may have written down the examples that you use, the countries that you study, the activities that you do. But there will be things that we all do across the key stages and across that primary and secondary transition that achieves these aims within the curriculum and encourages the development of student understanding and engagement with the subject. I now know what I would like an ideal geography student to know when they start Key Stage 3 in Year 7. But I think it's interesting to see how that might align with what primary practitioners think, and even what the students think as well. This here is a question that, to be honest, when I was training, it took me a little while to actually consider. I spent a long time making assumptions about what I thought they should know, without going ahead and finding out what they actually did know. I'd like you to pause the video here again and write down what you think are the basic concepts or the basic knowledge that a student needs to have about geography by the end of Key Stage 2. This can be from a primary or secondary perspective, depending on your background. Okay, this is what a small selection of Year 7 students entering Key Stage 3 think about geography and think about what they know. My first question is always, have you studied geography? Their responses, as you can see from this, are mixed. 4 of the students that I asked were unsure. Now, my response to that is they will have, maybe just not explicitly as a standalone subject. 12 of them said, no, we haven't studied geography. Again, I'm sure that they have. And then 11 said, yes, we have studied geography in primary school. So my response to that is, great, what is it then? And here we get a whole range of responses. Some are very specific, some are very broad, and there's a clear input from Key Stage 2, but somehow some students aren't always sure exactly what the subject actually is. We have things being said from geography, so rewriting the word but spelling it wrong. Mention of London or specific places, which, you know, they have a clear understanding of how geography links to location. We have mention of people, so there's an understanding of that conceptual link of geography being about human processes. We have earth, rivers, again, linking to all these processes. So this is what the Year 7 students think they know. But on the other hand, what would a secondary teacher expect them to know? This is a baseline test that we give students when they start at Key Stage 3, so right at the beginning of Year 7, to assess where we need to start. It's purely for teacher awareness. Students don't feel any pressure with it, but you can see here that in the first instance we expect locational knowledge. We have on there naming continents, naming countries in the UK, naming countries in Europe, lines of longitude, lines of latitude, that kind of thing. This then expands to more skills-based ideas, so compass points, map reading, that kind of thing, and then extended answers and conceptual understanding, so asking them about a country that they've studied and the physical and human processes, that kind of thing. The question really is, does this line up with what they cover in primary? And if not, where does it get covered? So how do they do in these baseline tests? The answer is mixed. There's often a gap between the two key stages, which isn't anyone's fault, but it makes it clear there needs to be a deeper understanding from both sides of what is expected in order to manage progression across the two key stages. Secondary teachers are now already viewing Key Stage 3 as a stepping stone to GCSE due to the increased rigour there. So expectations of what students need to achieve in Key Stage 3 is now much higher. But many are still not really sure what's being covered at primary level, so how can we see progression occurring across those key stages there? Right, everything so far in this session has been based on student or teacher ideas, but what does the national curriculum actually say? Now, we can see here that it's broad, we all know that, but we can see evidence of progression within even just this little section showing locational knowledge. So in Key Stage 1 is continents. Key Stage 2, that becomes countries. Key Stage 3, that becomes very specific countries or specific regions of the world. Again, here we're looking at the interaction between human and physical geography, and we can see the progression across the three key stages here as well. I can pick out straight away from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 that in Key Stage 2 we might look at volcanoes and earthquakes, whereas in Key Stage 3 we're looking at tectonics. So what are the other obvious overlaps or obvious areas of progression between the key stages? Pause the video here, pick out some other of the progressions, and how do you think that teaching of these might differ in the key stages? What would be covered differently? What would show progress? If you pause the video here and restart when you're ready. Okay, for interest's sake, where do they need to get to by Key Stage 4 or GCSEs? This is the kind of answer they'd be expected to give at the end of, this is the kind of question they'd be expected to answer at the end of Key Stage 4. It's very specific, includes locational knowledge, includes evaluation, includes use of sources. Key Stage 3, we're trying to get them there by giving them questions such as this one just here, where it's showing similar skills, but it's broken down a little bit more easily. Right, now there's an opportunity for you to think about planning for progression yourself and how you might plan lessons differently in different key stages. so that we can see that there is progression happening throughout the geography curriculum. Shortly, I'll ask you to pause the video again and plan a Key Stage 2 lesson on earthquakes. I'd like you to think about what would be the objective, the starter, activities for the development, and the plenary, and I'd like you to take just 5 minutes to do it. Once you've got a rough structure of a lesson, then I'd like you to think, what do you think needs to be added for a Key Stage 3 lesson on earthquakes that's within the topic tectonics? And then, how can your lesson at Key Stage 2 support this progression? The questions are on the slide there, so if you pause the video here and then restart it when you're ready. Now I'll show you what a number of lessons on tectonics may include at Key Stage 3, so that you can see what the progression from earthquakes to tectonics might look like. While I flick through a few examples, I'd like to think to yourself these questions we have at the top. What can you see that's different from a Key Stage 2 lesson? How has this shown progress? How might this progress to Key Stage 4 and GCSE even? If you want to pause at any point to have a look at the activities in more detail, then please do. I'm just going to run through them quite quickly. So here we have an activity all about plate boundaries. So not just the idea that the plates meet, but the idea that they meet in different ways. It would be a marketplace activity, so moving around, gathering information, and then sorting it into the correct spaces on the sheet. Here we have another example of slightly cross-curricular activity, asking them to kind of a bit of maths combined with geography. So encouraging comparison in levels of wealth and development of two countries that suffered from earthquakes, and then applying that understanding of their different levels of development to explaining why the effects might have been different in those countries. Another one again here, obviously geography is about location, so we need to locate our two case studies, but we're going to go a step further in Key Stage 3. We're going to locate them, we're going to describe their location, and then we're going to try and gather any other information as we can from the map. So here it's looking at those different plate margins or boundaries and gathering any information that we can. Here we're looking at the effects, not just effects, primary and secondary effects. So asking them to categorise in much more detail, and then potentially even as a challenge at the bottom, trying to find links between the effects, explain what the link is. So not just saying this happened, but this happened which meant that this happened, or this was a primary and this was a secondary. And then we have an example here of the kind of extended answer we might ask them to attempt, already trying to embed exam skills for Key Stage 4 and applying all that understanding to quite complex questions. Not just what were the impacts, but why are the impacts different in these two countries that we are comparing. And then that's how that links to Key Stage 4 as well. Hopefully that has allowed you to reflect a little on the differences between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. Take a minute to pause the video here and think about or write down some ideas to these questions. So what are the main differences between this and Key Stage 2, and what progression can we see occurring from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3? Right, finally, I'd like to leave you with a couple more questions to think about. Now that we have a more in-depth understanding of what progress in geography looks like, how can we show that that progress is being made? We need to ensure they know the basics. How do we show that they know the basics? How do we then develop that further between the key stages? And then what are the barriers to teaching geography at primary? And how can we overcome this to ensure that there is progression across all key stages? Thank you for watching. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions.